you with Chuck Leven, who is a board member of AARP, but also a World War II veteran, and you actually served in the Canadian Army.
Yes, that's right.
So let me dive right in on that one. How did you end up in the Canadian Army?
Well, it was kind of, I guess, amusing in a way, but also a little horrific in another. I tried to join the American Navy, U.S. Navy, and I went through the physical. I went down to Church Street in New York. I was 13 at that time. I looked older than my age. And I passed the physical. I was all set to go in, but they wanted a birth certificate, which obviously I couldn't produce because it would have been showing me as too young. So I decided after reading a magazine that I should go to Canada. So I hitchhiked up to Plattsburgh, New York, which is, you know, on the Canadian border. And I got there one night. I was now just turned 14. And I had 15 cents. And that meant, and it was bitter cold. It was December. Bitter cold. And I wasn't prepared for that. And so I went into a little cafeteria, a little diner of some sort, and I had a cup of coffee and a chocolate bar, and that used up all my resources. But I had read that fellows joining the Canadian Army were being put up at the jail overnight. So I went over to this little, the police department in Plattsburgh in those years was very small. It was a very small place. And I said to the desk sergeant that I was going up to join the Canadian Army. This is still 1941, when we were still at peace. And I would like to sleep there that night. I'd read that you could do that. He said, of course you can do that. So he said, I'll give you a blanket, and I'll open up a cell, and you can sleep there. And I thought, boy, that's terrific. He said, however, let me see your draft card. Well, I said, I don't have my draft card with me. He said, you can't not have your draft card. Everybody has to have a draft card. I said, no, I don't have it. Let me see your driver's license. I don't have that either. He said, put your hands on the wall. And he came down from behind the desk and he started to frisk me. And then he called in another guy, and the two of them put me in a little room, and they turned on a spotlight in my face and they started interrogating me. And I was really scared, so I started to cry. Then they knew. They thought I was a German spy trying to sneak into Canada. But once I started to cry, they knew that German spies didn't cry, so I obviously wasn't that. And then the fellow came in, he had a little ticker tape, and he said, your name is Charles Leven. You ran away from home, didn't you? So they sent me back home. That didn't deter me. A couple of months later, back to Canada, and I went into Montreal, and I went to a enlistment area. In the Canadian Army, it was mostly volunteers. And I enlisted in the Army, and the fellow said to me, how old are you? And I thought, well, I'll tell him I'm 17, because I won't be able to get away with more. And he said, I'm sorry, but you can't get in at 17. When you're 19, come back and we'll get you in. And he gave me a big wink. So I went out, and I came back in, he said, happy birthday, and he signed me up. And then that very night, I went to my basic training camp, because they were desperately short of soldiers. And what I didn't know, I enlisted in a regiment called the Black Watch, and I didn't know it was the infantry. But I found out immediately thereafter, because I was put in uniform and went to basic training. I was overseas in early 1942, and I found I was an infantry soldier, and that's where I stayed for the 4 years of the war. And I served in France and Belgium, Holland. It was a great experience. And then, unfortunately, I got into Germany, I got shot. And then I came back to Britain. By the time I recovered and was ready to go back up to the front, the war ended. So that's a very brief synopsis, if you will.
Well, let me...
Too fast.
No, that's a great summary. Let me go back. Now, you were joining the... What did you expect? And was it what you expected when you started? I mean, you obviously went through all this stuff to get in.
Yeah.
Then you get there. Was it what you expected?
Well, you have to remember the times. To be in the Army in a war was a very patriotic thing to do. And most kids wanted to do that. First of all, it was an adventure. Secondly, I didn't have to go to school anymore. That was a big attraction. And thirdly, it sounded like a very romantic kind of a thing. And it would mean I'd have reached my maturity, so to speak. So I expected it to be a very glamorous, exciting, interesting time. Didn't turn out to be quite like that. Canada in basic training in January and February is a very cold place. And we had these little Nissen huts, they were called, and they were lit by or heated rather, by a little stove, a little potbelly stove in the middle of the hut. And there were about 30 men in each hut, something like that, 30 or 40. And you slept on a little metal thing. It was a wooden bedstead, but it had little metal straps and a little mattress about that thin, and some blankets, and it was bitter cold. And so I quickly learned, I was quickly disillusioned, and learned that being a soldier was not a piece of cake like I thought.
Well, given, I mean, you are now 14?
Yep.
Did you think about, well, maybe I should tell them I'm 14 and
Very often.
go home?
Very often, but I decided I really wanted to stick it out. You know, we were on a 20-mile route march in the middle of that winter and marching in snow. I very often said to myself, I got to tell them, I got to get out of here. They gave me an intelligence test. It was really an aptitude test. And they said, you know, you're only about 14 or 15 on this aptitude test. And I said, well, that's because my schooling was very limited. So they ignored it. They needed men desperately. And as soon as we were done, we were right on a ship.
Well, I'd like to get to it, but you were obviously 14, were there in the people you were in basic training with, and I assume that you went over with those, or did you all disperse?
We went over with them and then we dispersed.
Were some of them also 14, 15, or
Well,
were you that much younger
Oh, yeah,
than?
I was a lot younger. You see, by then, most of the young men who were enthusiastic about the war had enlisted. So they now went to the prisons, and they offered anybody who had less than 4 years of a sentence, if they were willing to serve in the Army and serve with good conduct, they would erase their prison record. So most of the fellows in my platoon had been in prison. And I want to tell you, for a 14-year-old boy, this was some experience. They talked a language I didn't understand, even though it was English, and their whole point of view was something I didn't really understand. But they were pretty nice to me, actually. They didn't. They could have harassed me considerably, but they did not.
Now, you had originally wanted to be in the Navy. You didn't realize you weren't in the Navy?
Oh, I knew I wasn't. That was very clear. No, I was in the Army, because that's where it was easiest to get in.
Okay. Now, so when you went over, where did you go first?
We went to England first, and we were assigned to beach protection. The British still were afraid, although not terribly, I guess, of an invasion. So we patrolled the beaches in southern England, right near Dover, Brighton, places like that. And that consisted of, there were big minefields on both sides, right near the beach. And in between was a little narrow path, and there was barbed wire on both sides. And in the middle of the night, we each had 2-hour tours, and you went by yourself with a Thompson submachine gun up and down this path with no lights, of course. And you spent 2 hours doing this. And of course, at every sound, your heart went into your mouth. But that's basically what we did for a while. And then we went to a place called Dday in France in 1942. I think it was August, but I'm not sure. And my division was involved there. I was not on shore, I was in the boat. But we took terrible casualties. We lost, out of our group of 8,000 men who went in, we only about 2,000 came back. It was only 8 hours. It was a disaster. And then we reformed and refitted and got ready for the Dday invasion several years later.
Now, when you were in this situation with 8,000 soldiers.
Well, I wasn't on the beach, fortunately.
But you were now.
On a landing craft.
So did you know what was going on when it was going on, that this was this kind of carnage?
When you're in combat, there's so much happening, and you're in a very narrow little area. You have no grand view of what's happening at all. Basically, what you're trying to do is survive.
So when they refitted, you like reorganized this.
They brought in replacements and that kind of thing.
Now, when did you obviously you saw combat because they
Yeah,
shot you.
Yeah, yeah. That was in 1944.
When did you first see combat?
In the Normandy invasion. It was in June of 1944, and we landed on Gold Beach. And the Canadians did. The difficult beaches were the American beaches, really, Omaha particularly. Ours was not quite as difficult, and we didn't have as much resistance. And the division moved inland fairly quickly, as a matter of fact, to our initial objectives. And then we sat there for a while because we couldn't break through. And then ultimately, of course we did.
Now, you were in the Canadian Army, and you're now fighting next to the
We're
American.
next to British and American Army. There was a British Army and several American armies, actually.
Now, were there other Americans in the Canadian, or was it
Oh,
mostly
yeah,
Canadians?
yeah. But by that time, most of the Americans who'd been in the Canadian Army were allowed to go back. I couldn't do that because I couldn't establish, my age wasn't right. So I stayed in the Canadian Army.
Now, how, if you don't mind, how did you get shot, wounded?
Well, I was shrapnel, actually. A shell exploded near me, and I got hit in the shoulder. After a certain number of days of difficulty getting the doctor to attend to it, I was sent back to a field hospital. They operated, took it out. And they didn't, there were so many casualties, and they had very few doctors. So as a result, the doctors were relatively inexperienced, the surgeons. And what they would do is there were a whole bunch of men lying on stretchers, I don't know how many, a lot. And the doctor who was going to operate would draw a line with a crayon on your body where he was going to cut you. And then the chief surgeon came along and checked to be sure that what he was going to do made medical sense. And so they got into a big argument after he drew the line, because he drew the line from my shoulder down to my navel. And the chief surgeon started calling him names, and this guy was defending himself, and I'm lying there thinking, how do I check out of this hospital? Thank God it worked out. He didn't kill me, and I recovered. In fact, I was ready to go back to the front when I guess it was in May sometime, the war ended in Europe.
So you were basically there then through the 4 years that America was actually in the war, and and actually before that.
I was never in the United States during the war, so I have no idea what it was like here.
Now, obviously you trained with some men who were probably not a little out of the norm.
I would say.
Did you serve with some of those same fellas?
No, they dispersed. We all went to the different regiments. We were replacements, because our regiments had been overseas for a number of years at that point. Canada was in the war for 6 years from now.
Now, the men you did serve with, serving in those kinds of conditions and under that kind of pressure, what was the relationship like, and have they been lasting? Do you still have contact?
As I may have mentioned to you, I went to the 50th reunion of my regiment in Windsor, Canada, just I guess about a month ago. And that particular battalion in Canada, they enlisted everybody from the same town, which was a terrible mistake, because when a regiment got badly beaten up, the town lost a huge number of young men. And the battalion I was with, the Essex Scottish, we lost, I think something like 600 men out of the 800 men in the battalion. So you can imagine how devastating that was to Windsor, Ontario. So when we met, this was for me the first time in 50 years, I met some fellows who I'd actually served with, not been in contact with. And we all lined up, 50 of us who were left, who showed up at the reunion. And we were all wearing blue blazers and the gray slacks and that sort of thing. And a cap, a Glengarry cap, which is a blue cap that goes this way with a tail and a plaid around it. And we had the pipe band from the active Army battalion, which is in existence today, and they lined us up, And the major from the active battalion started yelling at us to get in line, you know, that sort of thing. And I realized, well, I never liked the Army. I thought, listen to this guy. And then pipe band started up, and we marched down the main street of Windsor to the cenotaph, and we had a little ceremony. It was quite moving. And it was interesting to see that there were still 50 men who were, I guess, number one, able to stand up and walk. But they were all fairly vigorous, which was surprising to me, frankly.
What was it like to see them again after all this time?
It was moving, actually, kind of moving. When we started to chat, and then, of course, everybody saw the war from a different point of view, as you can imagine, we're all individuals. But in some of the things they described, I was there, and I swear I don't remember it happening that way at all. But that's part of any group getting together after a long period of time. But it was interesting, and it was very heartwarming, actually.
Now, 50 years later, those 4 years, so you were through this, everything from the amazing story of how you got there to begin with, to getting wounded. What do you, is there one thing that kind of sticks out in your mind about the whole 4 years or so?
Probably not really. Growing up, maturing was so obvious, very quick, which means if you start something like that when you're 14 and you finish when you're 18, you really don't have a childhood, or a teenhood, I should say. So that's a little gap in your life that will never come back. On the other hand, when I came back, and I had to go back and start high school as a freshman, I realized how important education was. And I stayed in school. At that point, I welcomed school, which is something I hated up to that point. And we did high school in about a year and a half, because they had special high schools set up for vets. There were many of us, remember, it wasn't, you have to think back to what the world was like then. In the 1930s, an awful lot of people did not go to high school, and certainly didn't finish. They had to go to work. So that there were a lot of us who were vets. I was one of the youngest, but there were a lot older than me. Most of my class were made up of fellows who were in their 20s, who had never been to high school. And we all went, they set us up for an 18-month course, eliminated all the things like gym and that sort of thing. And we went 18 months continuously, graduated, and then we went to college on a GI Bill.
Now, you would run away to be part of this, and then it's over, you go home. How did you feel going home?
Very happy. I was glad to be there. Let me tell you. I was ready to be spoiled.
Really? Now, obviously, you went away a little boy. You came back.
Well, kind of half a man, anyway.
Would you say that experience, and how would you say that experience shaped the rest of your life?
I think it gives you, you have a better understanding of who you are and what life is all about. And there are very few things that faze you after spending 4 years in that situation. Things that perhaps in the ordinary course of events are earth-shattering events, no longer so earth-shattering, because you have a better sense of proportion, let's put it that way, about life in general.
Your group of, I guess there's 50 who were, but started out, so many of them seem to have been killed or wounded.
That's right.
When you were going through it, how did you cope with that?
You can only cope with it day to day, and you take it as it becomes the norm. The normal is to live in a trench, or slip trench as we call them. The normal is to be dirty. The normal is to be hungry. The normal is to be bored most of the time and scared certain parts of the time, and really frightened beyond anything that's, I suspect you can contemplate. And then you do some things which I really don't want to talk about, and you see things that I don't want to talk about, and that you really don't forget the rest of your life. And the one thing you do above all hate is war. least for people like who went through the experience.
And obviously, some of the horrific things are on this side. Is there a piece of that whole time where something wildly funny or like a wonderful memory that you have of that, where you say, I'll remember that all my life, it was like one of the funniest times or the greatest times, or
The thing I remember most of my life is at the end of December, the last day of December 1945. I was at a place called Longueuil, Quebec, which is where the Expo 67 was held. At that time, it was an Army demobilization center. And I reached the door, and a guy handed me this piece of paper that said I was discharged. I walked out the door and outside the camp. And that was the happiest moment, I think, of that 4-year experience.
it seems appropriate.
Yeah, it was appropriate, let me tell you.
Well, anything you'd like to add? This is it's terrific. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.